bargain at the flea market? I wonder if it'll last.
You'll regret insulting me!
A disabled Marine walked by. Minutes later, the SEALs made them regret it. The scorching Texas sun beat down on the construction site in downtown Houston as Marine veteran Sarah Miller walked slowly past the chain-link fence, her prosthetic leg creating a distinctive rhythm against the cracked sidewalk. At 32, Sarah carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen combat, lost friends, and survived what many could not. Her left leg, lost to an IED blast in Fallujah 3 years earlier, had been replaced with a functional prosthetic that allowed her to walk, but marked her as different in a world that often struggled to understand sacrifice. The construction workers noticed her immediately. Frank Harris, the site foreman, was the first to speak up, his voice cutting through the noise of machinery and hammering. "Hey boys, looks like we got ourselves a charity case walking by." Harris called out, his words dripping with cruel amusement. "Someone call the VA, we've got a stray." The laughter that followed was harsh and immediate. Workers stopped what they were doing to watch Sarah pass, some pointing at her prosthetic leg, others making exaggerated limping motions in mockery. One younger worker pulled out his phone, filming the scene for what he planned to post on social media. "Wrong turn to the welfare office, sweetheart," another voice shouted, triggering more cruel laughter across the site. Sarah gripped her Marine cap tighter, her jaw set and eyes focused straight ahead. She didn't stop, didn't flinch, didn't give them the reaction they were seeking. They didn't know that she had once dragged wounded Marines through gunfire, that her limp was earned in service to her country, not faked for sympathy. They saw only what they wanted to see, someone they perceived as weak, different, deserving of their ridicule. What the construction workers didn't notice was the black Chevrolet Suburban parked across the street, its tinted windows concealing the occupant who had been watching the entire scene unfold. Inside, retired Navy SEAL Jacob Stone sat in stunned recognition, his hands gripping the steering wheel as memories of Fallujah came flooding back. Jacob remembered that day in 2019 when Sergeant Sarah Miller had made 3 separate runs across open ground under enemy fire, pulling wounded civilians and fellow Marines to safety. On her 3rd trip, the second IED had detonated, taking her leg but saving the life of the man she was carrying, a Navy SEAL named Jacob Stone. Now watching the woman who had saved his life being publicly humiliated, Jacob reached for his phone with deadly calm. Jacob Stone's call went out to his former SEAL team with the urgency of a combat operation. "It's Stone," he said into his phone, his voice carrying the controlled intensity that his teammates recognized from their years of dangerous missions together. "I need a convoy at my location. We have a situation involving a Marine who saved my life in Fallujah." The response was immediate and unquestioning. Within minutes, 3 black SUVs were converging on the construction site from different directions, their occupants understanding that when Jacob Stone called for help, it was for something that mattered. Sarah continued walking, unaware of the response her humiliation had triggered. She had learned to endure such treatment since returning from Iraq, but each incident still cut deep, reminding her of how differently the world saw her now. The confident Marine who had once led troops through combat zones had been replaced in many people's eyes by someone to be pitied or mocked. Back at the construction site, Frank Harris was still enjoying the entertainment he had created. "Did you see how she tried to look all tough?" he said to his crew, probably never even saw real combat. These disability fakers are everywhere these days. His words were met with more laughter from workers who had never served their country, never faced enemy fire, never made the kind of sacrifices that Sarah had made without question. They were comfortable in their ignorance, secure in their assumption that they would never face consequences for their cruelty. The first sign that something had changed came when the black SUVs arrived with military precision, blocking the construction site's main entrance. The vehicles moved in perfect coordination, their occupants emerging with the kind of synchronized efficiency that marked elite military units. 7 Navy SEALs stepped out of the vehicles, their presence immediately commanding attention and respect. They weren't in uniform, but everything about their bearing, their movement, and their focused intensity marked them as warriors. The construction site, which had been filled with crude laughter moments before, fell into stunned silence. Jacob Stone led the group, his eyes scanning the construction crew with the same tactical assessment he had once used in combat zones. He identified Frank Harris immediately. The man's body language and position marked him as the leader, the one responsible for what had happened to Sarah. "Which one of you thought it was funny to mock a Marine veteran?" Jacob asked, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet construction site. Frank Harris, his earlier bravado evaporating in the face of these obviously dangerous men, tried to maintain his authority. "Look, I don't know who you guys think you are, but this is a private construction site. You need to—" "I know exactly who I am," Jacob interrupted, his voice remaining calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge of menace. "I'm the Navy SEAL that Sergeant Sarah Miller saved in Fallujah when she lost her leg, pulling my bleeding body out of a kill zone." The revelation hit the construction crew like a physical blow. The woman they had been mocking wasn't just any disabled person. She was a decorated combat veteran who had sacrificed her leg, saving the life of one of America's elite warriors. She made 3 trips across open ground under enemy fire. Jacob continued, his words carrying to every corner of the site. 3 trips to save lives while you cowards were probably sitting at home watching TV. The construction site had transformed from a place of crude mockery to a scene of absolute tension as Jacob Stone and his SEAL team faced down the workers who had humiliated Sarah. Frank Harris, the foreman, who had led the ridicule, now found himself confronting men whose very presence radiated the kind of danger that came from years of combat experience. "Sergeant Miller didn't just save my life." Jacob continued, his voice growing stronger as he recounted the events that had forever linked him to Sarah. "She saved 3 lives that day: a Marine corporal, a civilian contractor, and me. She was already wounded from the first blast when she came back for me." One of the younger SEALs, Master Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, stepped forward with a tablet in his hands. "We recorded everything," he announced to the construction crew. "Every word, every laugh, every cruel gesture. The whole thing is documented." The workers who had been so eager to mock Sarah now looked uncomfortable, some backing away from the confrontation, others staring at the ground in shame. The teenager, who had been filming for social media, had long since put his phone away, understanding that he had captured something that would bring him shame rather than viral fame. Frank Harris, still trying to salvage his authority, made the mistake of doubling down on his earlier cruelty. "Look, I don't care what she did over there. This is America, and I have the right to say what I want." Jacob's response was swift and devastating. "You have the right to be a coward and a bully," he said, stepping closer to Harris. "But rights come with consequences, and today you're going to learn what those consequences look like." Rodriguez pulled out his phone and began making a call. "This is Master Chief Rodriguez. I need to speak with the project manager for the Morrison Construction Company." "Yes, I'll hold." While Rodriguez worked to contact Harris's superiors, Jacob continued his confrontation with the foreman. Sergeant Miller never asked for recognition for what she did. She never sought medals or parades. She just did her job, saved lives, and came home broken but proud. And you thought it was funny to mock her sacrifice. The other SEALs had positioned themselves strategically around the construction site, their presence ensuring that no one could leave without facing the consequences of their actions. They weren't threatening violence, but their mere presence was enough to make it clear that this situation would be resolved on their terms. "I've got the project manager on the line," Rodriguez announced. "He wants to speak with you, Harris." Frank Harris reluctantly took the phone, his face growing pale as he listened to his boss's reaction to the news that his crew had been caught on video mocking a disabled Marine veteran. The conversation was brief and one-sided, with Harris mostly listening and occasionally stammering out weak excuses. When he handed the phone back to Rodriguez, Harris's demeanor had completely changed. I've been removed from this project," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Effective immediately." But Jacob wasn't finished. "That's just the beginning," he said. "You see, Sergeant Miller is more than just a hero. She's family, and when someone attacks our family, we respond." The SEAL team began moving with purpose, some heading toward the construction site's office, others documenting the scene and the workers who had participated in the mockery. It was clear that this wasn't just about immediate consequences. They were building a case that would have lasting impact. "Every one of you who laughed, who pointed, who thought it was funny to mock a disabled veteran is going to face consequences," Jacob announced to the assembled workers. "Your faces are on video, your voices are recorded, and your actions are documented." One of the younger construction workers, a man barely out of his teens, stepped forward with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaking. "I didn't know. I should have known better anyway, but I didn't understand what she had done." Jacob looked at the young man with something approaching respect. "At least you have the courage to apologize," he said. "That's more than your foreman showed." As the SEALs continued their methodical response to the incident, word began to spread beyond the construction site. Rodriguez had contacted local news outlets, veterans organizations, and social media influencers who specialized in military stories. The video of Sarah's humiliation and the SEALs' response was about to become a national story. The construction workers who had thought they were having harmless fun at the expense of a disabled woman were about to learn that their actions had consequences that would extend far beyond their job site. The crisis escalated rapidly as news of the incident spread through military and veteran networks across the country. Within hours of the SEALs' intervention at the construction site, the story had been picked up by major news outlets, veterans advocacy groups, and social media platforms, where it was shared thousands of times. Morrison Construction Company found itself at the center of a public relations nightmare as videos of their workers mocking Sarah Miller went viral. The company's phones were flooded with calls from angry veterans, military families, and civilians who were outraged by what they had witnessed. "We're getting calls from every major news network," reported Jennifer Walsh Morrison Construction's public relations director during an emergency meeting with company executives. "This story is everywhere, and the public response is overwhelmingly negative." The company's stock price began to drop as investors worried about the long-term impact of being associated with the mistreatment of disabled veterans. Several major clients called to express their concerns, and some threatened to cancel contracts if the company didn't take immediate action. Meanwhile, Sarah Miller remained unaware of the storm that had erupted around her story. She had returned to her small apartment following her usual routine of preparing dinner and watching the evening news. It wasn't until her phone began ringing with calls from reporters that she realized something significant had happened. "Ms. Miller, this is Channel 7 News. We'd like to interview you about the incident at the construction site today," said the first caller. Sarah was confused. "What incident? I don't know what you're talking about." But as more calls came in and as friends began texting her links to news stories and videos, Sarah began to understand what had happened. The mockery she had endured in silence had been witnessed, recorded, and was now being seen by millions of people across the country. The emotional impact was overwhelming. Sarah had spent 3 years learning to live with the stares, the whispers, and the occasional cruel comments that came with her visible disability. She had developed thick skin and a determination to not let others' ignorance affect her. But seeing her humiliation broadcast to the world was almost more than she could bear. "I never wanted this," she told her friend and fellow veteran Maria Santos during a tearful phone call. "I just wanted to be left alone. Now everyone is going to be looking at me, pitying me, treating me like a victim." Maria, who had served with Sarah in Iraq, understood her friend's distress. "Sarah, you're not a victim. You're a hero, and the world is finally seeing what those of us who served with you have always known." But Sarah's crisis wasn't just emotional, it was also practical. The attention was making it impossible for her to maintain the quiet, private life she had built since returning from Iraq. Reporters were calling constantly, photographers were gathering outside her apartment building, and well-meaning strangers were showing up at her door wanting to thank her for her service. The situation became even more complicated when Sarah learned that Jacob Stone, the SEAL she had saved in Fallujah, was the one who had organized the response at the construction site. She had never sought recognition for her actions that day, and she certainly hadn't expected them to lead to a national controversy. "I need to see him," Sarah told Maria. "I need to understand why he did this." The meeting between Sarah and Jacob was arranged at a quiet coffee shop away from the media attention. When Sarah walked in, using her cane for support, Jacob stood immediately, his face showing a mixture of respect, gratitude, and concern. "Sergeant Miller," he said, offering her a chair, "I want you to know that I never intended for this to become such a big story. I just couldn't stand by and watch those cowards mock the woman who saved my life." Sarah looked at him with tired eyes. "I appreciate what you did, but I never asked for this attention. I've been trying to build a quiet life, and now that's impossible." Jacob nodded, understanding her distress. "I know, and I'm sorry for that. But maybe this attention can be used for something good. Maybe your story can help other veterans who are facing the same kind of treatment." The crisis had reached a turning point. Sarah could retreat from the public eye and try to return to her quiet life, or she could embrace the opportunity to become a voice for disabled veterans who face discrimination and mockery every day. The decision Sarah faced was more complex than simply choosing between privacy and publicity. As the story continued to dominate news cycles and social media, she began to understand that her response would have implications far beyond her own life. Veterans organizations across the country were reaching out, asking her to become a spokesperson for disabled veterans' rights. Schools were requesting her to speak to students about service and sacrifice. The attention she had never wanted was creating opportunities she had never imagined. Jacob Stone had taken it upon himself to help Sarah navigate the overwhelming response to her story. He arranged for a team of public relations professionals to manage the media requests, and he worked with veterans organizations to create a structured way for Sarah to use her newfound platform if she chose to do so. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do," Jacob assured her during one of their planning meetings. "But I want you to know that your story is already making a difference. We're getting reports from across the country of people standing up for disabled veterans, of businesses implementing sensitivity training, of communities coming together to support their local heroes." The evidence of impact was undeniable. Morrison Construction Company had not only fired Frank Harris, but had implemented company-wide training on veterans issues and had donated $100,000 to disabled veterans organizations. Other construction companies had followed suit, creating industry-wide changes in how workers were trained to interact with the public. Roosevelt High School in Houston had invited Sarah to speak during their Veterans Day assembly, and the response from students and faculty had been overwhelming. Sarah had initially been nervous about speaking in public, but when she saw the faces of the teenagers listening to her story, she understood the power of her experience to educate and inspire. "Scars don't mean you're broken," Sarah had told the assembled students. "They mean you survived something that tried to break you and you kept walking." The speech had been recorded and shared online, where it reached millions of viewers and became a rallying cry for disabled veterans and anyone facing adversity. The climactic moment came when Sarah was invited to speak at the National Veterans Conference in Washington, D.C. The invitation came from the highest levels of the Department of Veterans Affairs, and it represented an opportunity to address thousands of veterans, military leaders, and government officials about the challenges faced by disabled veterans in civilian society. Sarah spent weeks preparing for the speech, working with Jacob and other advisors to craft a message that would honor her fellow veterans while addressing the systemic issues that led to discrimination and misunderstanding. On the day of the conference, Sarah stood before an audience of over 3,000 people, her prosthetic leg visible beneath her dress uniform. In the front row sat Jacob Stone and his SEAL team, along with a young boy wearing a red hoodie who had a prosthetic arm, a child who had reached out to Sarah after seeing her story and had become a symbol of the next generation of Americans learning about courage and resilience. "I never wanted to be a symbol," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "I just wanted to serve my country, come home, and live a quiet life. But sometimes life has other plans for us." She spoke about her service in Iraq, about the day she lost her leg saving Jacob and others, and about the challenges she faced returning to civilian life. But more importantly, she spoke about the responsibility that all Americans had to support and respect those who had served. Courage doesn't always roar, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she reached the climax of her speech. Sometimes courage whispers. Sometimes it walks with a limp. Sometimes it wears a small red hoodie and holds its head high despite the stares. The young boy in the front row smiled and waved his prosthetic arm, drawing applause from the audience that understood the reference. The construction workers who mocked me that day weren't evil people, Sarah continued. They were ignorant people who had never been taught to see beyond the surface, to understand that scars tell stories of survival, not failure. Sarah's speech built to a powerful conclusion that challenged everyone present to become advocates for understanding and respect. Every one of you has the power to change how disabled veterans are treated in your communities. Every time you see someone being mocked or discriminated against because of their disabilities, you have a choice. You can be silent, or you can be the voice that says, "Not in my presence, not in my community, not in my America." The standing ovation that followed lasted over 2 minutes, with veterans, government officials, and military leaders all rising to honor not just Sarah's service, but her courage in using her experience to educate and inspire others. After the speech, Sarah was approached by dozens of veterans who shared their own stories of discrimination and thanked her for giving them a voice. She was also approached by business leaders, educators, and community organizers who wanted to work with her to create lasting change. The climax of Sarah's journey from victim to advocate was complete, but it was clear that her real work was just beginning. The woman who had once saved lives on the battlefield was now saving lives in a different way, using her story to build bridges of understanding and respect between military and civilian communities. Jacob Stone watched from the side of the auditorium as Sarah was surrounded by people wanting to thank her and work with her. The SEAL, who had once been saved by her courage, was now witnessing her save countless others through her willingness to transform personal pain into public purpose. 1 year after the incident at the Houston construction site, the impact of Sarah Miller's story continued to ripple through American society in ways that no one could have anticipated. The Sarah Miller Protocol had been adopted by construction companies, retail businesses, and service organizations across the country, requiring sensitivity training for employees who interacted with disabled customers and veterans. Morrison Construction Company had not only survived the initial crisis, but had emerged as a leader in veteran employment and disability awareness. The company now actively recruited disabled veterans, provided specialized training for all employees, and had established a scholarship fund for children of disabled veterans. Frank Harris, the foreman whose cruel mockery had started the entire chain of events, had undergone a personal transformation that surprised everyone who knew him. After losing his job and facing public humiliation, he had enrolled in veterans advocacy training and now worked as a volunteer counselor, helping other people understand the impact of their words and actions on disabled veterans. "I was ignorant and cruel," Harris would tell groups during sensitivity training sessions. "I thought I was just having fun, but I was attacking a hero who had sacrificed more for this country than I could ever imagine." Sarah herself had found a new purpose that fulfilled her in ways her military service never had. She had established the Quiet Heroes Foundation, which provided support and advocacy for disabled veterans facing discrimination. The foundation had helped hundreds of veterans find employment, housing, and the respect they deserved. Jacob Stone and his SEAL team had become regular supporters of Sarah's work, using their own platforms and networks to amplify her message and support disabled veterans across the country. The bond forged in combat had evolved into a partnership that was changing lives and communities. The young boy with the prosthetic arm who had attended Sarah's speech in Washington had become a regular correspondent, sending her letters about his own experiences and the confidence he had gained from her example. "You taught me that being different doesn't mean being less," he wrote in one letter. "You taught me that scars are proof that we survived something difficult and kept going." Sarah's story had become more than just a tale of one veteran's experience. It had become a movement that reminded America that heroes walk among us every day, often quietly, often unrecognized, but always deserving of our respect and gratitude. The disabled Marine, who had walked past a construction site in silence, had found her voice and used it to ensure that no veteran would ever again have to face such humiliation alone. This story demonstrates how individual acts of cruelty can be transformed into movements for positive change when people of courage choose to stand up for what is right, and how the bonds forged in service can create lasting networks of support and advocacy.